So this is the second time that we've held one of these forum meetings, and we held it in this room last year. And I mean, I think it's a rather wonderful room because it reminds us of the sort of power of engineering and technology from a slightly bygone age. And I once had the privilege of visiting the Rolls-Royce factory where they make modern jet engines as opposed to dynamos or whatever these are. But it's still a most amazing, astonishing assembly line, slightly different to the assembly line for most of the products that we're talking about today. But the modern assembly line is even more sophisticated in terms of the complexity of the products that are now being manufactured. So we've got 4 sessions today. And the great thing about a room of this size is that it enables everyone to participate. So we've got some fantastic panels, but the quality of this meeting is as much in your hands as it is in the hands of the wonderful speakers we've got, because we, I think, have the opportunity to have a very engaged discussion. And so I hope you'll all take advantage of the fantastic panels of speakers that we've got. This is my main role today, which is to introduce it, and I may ask the odd question because I'm not very good at keeping quiet. But I'm going to hand over now to Professor Sir Munir Pirmohamed, who's the David Weatherall Professor of Medicine at the University of Liverpool, who will introduce the panel. And I think the first topic is an extraordinarily interesting one, which is the whole question about the resilience of supply chains. And resilience is something that is extremely important to the health, well-being and security of the population, but it's something that governments are not necessarily as good as they should be at thinking about in advance. And there's no question that there are 2 events in the past 3 or 4 years that have really emphasized the importance of this as a topic. One was COVID, and I'm sure that may come up. But the other, of course, is the war in Ukraine. And if anyone wanted a lesson on the importance of economic geography, it is actually Ukraine. But also, if you're interested in modern supply chains, then there were no microchips then. But there's microchips in almost everything now. And we're highly reliant on Taiwan for the supply of microchips. So this is actually a hugely important topic. And I think that everyone had taken the resilience of supply lines in biomedicine too much for granted. Although I was talking earlier to one of the panelists, and I remember in 2008 or 9 when the H1N1 flu pandemic was happening, that I went to a meeting in the States where they got a fright because they'd realized then they hadn't got vaccine manufacturing capability. And they've sort of partly fixed that. But, you know, when things go pear-shaped, then supply chains tend to get nationalized. And so this is actually, I think, an exceptionally important and very interesting subject area. So with that, I'll shut up and hand over to Munir.
Thank you very much, Mark. Can you hear me okay? Great. Well, welcome everybody, and it's a great pleasure to be chairing this panel on resilience in medicine supply. As Mark said, I work in Liverpool at the University of Liverpool, and I'm here and I'm missing the Eurovision Song Contest to be here, by the way. So it's important to remember that. Okay, so as a clinical pharmacologist, I'm a clinical pharmacologist by background. I was aware of some of the issues associated with medicine supply. But when Mark asked me to chair this panel, I started looking more into this. And it's complicated, that's the first thing to say. And as Mark said, when he sort of asked me to chair this, that the primary responsibility of any government is to protect its citizens. And clearly, availability of medicines is part of that responsibility. And when you start looking at the medicine supply chains and so on, it is extremely complex, and our panelists will be able to show you how complex that it is. But it seems to me that we're hearing much more about this at the moment. And the question is, are we having more problems now than in the past? It's been around for a long time, I think, the medicine supply issues. Or is it that we just got better data that allows us to be able to identify the medicine supply problems now? So it may be a combination of the two. Clearly, there have been many other issues which are going on, geopolitics, the pandemic, and many people are sort of quite keen to blame Brexit on this as well. But is it Brexit may actually have had advantages in some ways because we built up a stockpile of medicines. but nevertheless, Brexit may have had some effect as well. So it'd be good to understand exactly what things have been happening and so on over the last few years. So the purpose of the panel today really is to debate the issues that are important for medicine supply and think about how we can actually start thinking about developing resilience in that medicine supply. And what I have is a star-studded panel in front of me who are going to tell you about different aspects of medicine supply. So what I'm going to do is to ask them to introduce themselves and just give a perspective from the sort of, industry that they work in and their role in medicine supply. Then I've got some questions I'm going to ask them. Then I'm going to open it up to the audience to be able to ask any questions. So please do think of questions. It'd be really good to get some questions from the audience. So let me start off by introduction. So Luisa, first of all.
Hi everyone, good morning. It's a pleasure being here. So I'm Luisa Freitas Santos, and I currently head up the global clinical supply chain at GSK. So that is the responsibility for manufacturing and supplying and supporting all the clinical trials that are ongoing across the globe in about 60 countries, and covering all the therapeutic areas as well. That includes the medicines and vaccines. But I am a chemical engineer by training, and actually I'm very close to where I studied and did my PhD and postdoc just behind us. So it's always a pleasure to be here, actually, in this location. And but I have worked in medicine R&D, always in R&D for well over 25 years, let's say, and over that period of time, obviously the evolution of technologies and the evolution actually of the medicines and the innovation have been fantastic. But with that innovation and complexity, the supply chain that is required to support it and to produce and to supply is incredibly complex. And bring it to the topic that we're discussing today, I think that I never had so much interest in what I do, like with COVID and what happened, because suddenly, sort of my title created an interest. Oh my gosh, everyone is talking about supply chain and supply chain resilience. And with the COVID, I think it was really a spotlight and just opened up for an understanding, but also exposed quite a lot of the vulnerabilities and how complex it is, how global it is, how interdependent it is. And, there isn't one magical solution. So I was, I suppose, privileged that I was able to contribute in 3 ways. Obviously, the first thing is the safety of our own staff and being able to continue. And we didn't stop one single day working the labs and the plants to continue manufacturing medicines and vaccines. The other was to ensure that all our clinical trials were still ongoing and supported and flowing. And we managed that. And, with a lot of trials, for example, in oncology, it's really, important to follow through and to continue to supply. And then the third one, I was a part of the task force looking at not only resilience, but solutions. And there was a team that was looking into vaccines, and there was a team that was looking at treatments, looking what there was available, what there wasn't, and really the collaboration that happened, with other companies, with government and other, generics, innovators. It was just amazing. So that experience was incredible. Maybe we can discuss some of those aspects. And then, of course, as we were stepping out and starting to recover, war in Europe, war in Ukraine, which just threw another element of, challenge, and supply routes disrupted, and they were already disrupted, so now even more. I'll leave it here and see maybe we can go back and pick up on some of these topics.
Great, thank you very much, Luisa. Ravi.
Hi, morning. So my name is Ravi Limaye. I work for Wockhardt, based in Wrexham, which at the moment is, as Sir Munir would agree, is known for football more than anything else. So I have been in the pharma industry for over 30 years. Most of my time I spent in GlaxoSmithKline, followed by Novartis, and presently working with Wockhardt as the CEO of the company. Wockhardt became very visible during the pandemic because we were associated with the manufacturing of the AstraZeneca Oxford vaccine. So I have actually experienced what is supply chain resilience at its worst and at its best during the pandemic. Just a couple of comments about how complex supply chain is. Now, if you look at the importance of supply chain, the context of the patient is obvious. We all know that a resilient supply chain is very critical for patient. And Sir Munir said very rightly that the job of the government is to protect its citizens, and medicines is an important part of that. However, if you really see, apart from patients, the impact of supply chain on the pharmaceutical industry is huge. Just to give you some statistics, I recently read a McKinsey report which said that out of every 10 years, almost 30% of 1 year's profit is lost due to supply chain issues. Now, if you sort of do a simple arithmetic, this would be about 4 or 5% of loss of profit every year. Yeah. Going further, while things like pandemic is really unusual, and this is an exception, it happens once in 100 years. But minor supply chain disruptions, like say a disruption for 1 month, is also not very uncommon. It happens, as per statistics, almost once in 5 to 7 years. And imagine if that's what it's going to cause in terms of loss of profits. You can imagine what it means to the industry. And obviously, the patient is at the foremost. One of the reasons why supply chain is very complex is because increasingly pharma supply chains are less concentrated and more diverse geographically. Just to give you an idea, generic industry almost accounts for 90% of prescriptions in US, almost 70% of all prescriptions in Germany. I couldn't find the data for UK, but it would be almost in the same range. And there's a lot of dependence on countries like India and China, especially in the API area, in the supply chain. And that's why it's very complex, And you all know what happened during the pandemic, with countries blocking export of medicines, APIs, generics, and so on. Another interesting thing that I think I need to point out is that if you look at what really causes problems in supply chain, data suggests that 40% of the problems are internal and 30% of the problems are external. Yeah. So I'll talk about it more maybe at a later stage, but supply chain issues are not necessarily only external. They are very much internal as well. Yeah. So I think these were some of the points I thought I would make in my opening remarks, and then more.
We can pick up on some of those a bit later. So Bruce from representing the NHS.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Bruce Warner. I'm the Deputy Chief Pharmaceutical Officer at NHS England. So I'm a pharmacist by training. And I've worked in most areas of pharmacy throughout my career, but particularly in patient safety before I came into this post, and worked at the National Patient Safety Agency on medicines-related issues. And I think safety really is at the heart of what we do with medicines. Keeping our patients safe is absolutely the #1 priority. So when we see problems in the supply chain, that's always where we go to first, is how are we going to keep our patients safe. And I chair a UK-wide cross-organisational committee called the Medicine Shortage Response Group, which looks very much at medicine shortages that come through that we start to see, and thinks about how we can mitigate against patients coming to harm as a result of those shortages. So that's a three-stage process. We first of all need to know there's a shortage, and we'll perhaps come on to talk about that a bit later. But getting that notification that there's a problem is really important, and getting that early is really important. And we get that from a whole range of sources, including from the industry itself, but also from the practitioners out there, the doctors, the pharmacists that are telling us they're struggling to get hold of things, and of course from patients as well, who quite often contact us and say, what's going on, we can't get hold of this medicine. So we need to know about it. We then need to risk assess that issue. We need to look at what's the medicines used for. Are there alternatives? Are there direct therapeutic substitutions that can be employed? What's the market share? How big is the problem? How critical is that medicine? All that kind of thing. So we make an assessment of the likely impact on the patients of that shortage. And then, of course, we try and work up mitigations. What can we do to make sure our patients don't come to harm? And of course, many of our patients, it is literally a matter of life and death whether they get their medicines or not. And so we have a whole range of mitigations that we employ depending on what the shortage is. And again, we can talk about those later. But I think the real key to what we do is the cooperation between all of those different bodies involved. So we work really closely with the MHRA and with the Department of Health, who have the official remit for medicine supply and ensuring that supply chain resilience. We work with all the devolved administrations. We work with patient groups, and we work with other stakeholders, with the practitioners themselves, to try and work out how we can best manage the problems. And what I would say is the teams that actually work on that, one of which sits within the Department of Health and one of which sits in NHS England, depending on what the issue is. They do remarkable work, and at any one time we have dealing with up to 200 medicine shortages, of which only less than 10 most people ever are aware of. So those mitigations are employed in a way that if we do our job well, nobody ever notices. It's only when things go really, things are really quite serious, then we start to alert the system and put those mitigations in place. But as I say, we can talk about some of those a bit later on. Thank you.
From Stockholm to be with us.
Thank you. I work for IQVIA. Most of you might not have heard about it. We are a large, let's call it, service provider to all stakeholders in the pharmaceutical sector. Our company really started with collecting consumption data. And actually we supplied, for example, NHS hospitals with their own data back for many years here. So our skill was from the beginning to collect data, nurture it, and present it back to different parts. Today we are certainly data still. We are consulting. We have a very big consulting group on different parts. We are very much a technology company, and actually most people in our company works to perform clinical trials. We probably have about 70,000 people working on clinical trials around the world. I'm responsible for the relation with both the supply chain data sources we are using as wholesalers, pharmacies, and so on an EMEA basis. I also work very much with Brussels, the associations that we have on a pan-European basis, and the Commission part, so DG Santé, or EMA that we have represented over in that corner on different things. My role is to try to be, quote unquote, independent and objective and fact-based. A lot of things that's happening, not the least on our shortage thing, is because everyone else blames everyone else or try to keep certain information back from them to take a rational decision. And we try to be neutral and objective in what we're saying. Yes, now it's a lot about pharma policy in Europe. You know that on the 26th there was a very long document presented, not very radical, probably, well, I shouldn't give it too much part. I also work a lot on the shortage issues, trying to bridge some of the gaps here. And one of the things that we have built, previously shortages has been analyzed by academics every now and then, and we ourselves published in 2019, just before COVID, what the status was for shortages in Europe. And at that time, it was mostly, as you said, about quality issues or production problem issues. But we've learned that that is a too slow information. Today, not for UK, but because your data is not publicly available, but for the 25 EU countries, I can tell what the shortage situation was last week. So we are a part of the new environment which is using artificial intelligence and web scraping. We are collecting all the information on a weekly basis. We normalize the data, and hell, you need to normalize this data because the compliance on how things are reported and so on is actually quite low. And we try to tell what the story is just now, and I'll probably come back later on that. And after COVID, the situation, and it's the same here, is slightly different. We have had many of the shortages is demand shift. COVID created waves here, but we also have the HRT story naturally, and the next one we discussed is going to be obesity. That is going to generate shortages here. My starting point for shortages is that it's something we should not accept to be on this level. It's really a failure of the system. There's too much that everyone point fingers and saying, it's not my fault, it's them who have to do it, and we have to do it together. And one of the starting points for this is a much higher level of transparency. And ultimately, the only way you actually resolve shortages is that we are by producing the right levels of the product. We actually, in the end, need to help the producers to have information early enough to what the demand will be. And then the producers are, as you said, extremely happy to produce the right levels. And a little here, the cost, especially for a brand manufacturer, to run into shortages, there's a long-term cost of a lost patient, maybe over several years going forward, that has been switched to something else. I heard the word a little about this with globalization, and we have benefited tremendously on the globalization in that it has helped us to reduce the cost very drastically. But now we see the flip side, and now we need to balance the issue between cost and reliability of supply in difficult situation. And that might have a price, because medicine today, especially generic medicine today, is extremely low cost versus I used to have a slide where we went out and bought a candy and calculate the cost per pill in the candy. And I'll tell you, medicine is really cheap in many cases today. That's my
Thank you very much for that. So let's start off with the first question really is, and it'd be good to hear first of all from Big Pharma and then generics and really then from the informatics perspective, what do you think are the biggest areas of risk in the global medical supply chain at the moment? And coming back to my remarks earlier on, is this something that's more acute now, or have we had this problem all the time and we're just noticing it more because we have better data sources? So maybe Luisa, start off from Big Pharma. You have a global role. So what are the biggest risks at the moment in the global medical supply chain?
So I think that the panel already identified a few, and I think that it's the global nature and the interdependencies that is, the ability to have real time and to have the visibility across, the globe of all the nodes. Of course, if we've got a perturbation to some of those, it will create the waves that Pearl was talking about, for sure. So that is a risk, because there was a lot of the globalization allowed us to move fast, allowed us to have much more cost-effective, medicines, really. So in terms of medicine access, patient access, it's been very good. But on the flip side, actually, it is a risk, because we are so dependent on multiple nodes, on that connectivity, and so any perturbation, causes an issue. I think that, some of the, and in particular, because I'm speaking from an R&D standpoint, the evolution and some of the innovation, the molecules that we have today, they have more complexity. So it's a variety of platforms for production, for developing, for testing. So, of course, if you increase that level of complexity in terms of the risks, you also increase a number of risks, right, to make work. And I think that, the other risk, I think it's that ability to anticipate. We need to be able to anticipate, to predict, to see, because, you cannot switch a supply chain. You need to go back. If you need to redo and start manufacturing your drug substance and then your drug product and everything else, it can take many, many months. So I think that the other risk is, some of the data sources and some of that transparency and the ability to see and connect that data so that we can predict. We're still not there, and I think that COVID has shown that. In some countries and some areas, it is better, but that is a risk, not being able to react fast enough, because you don't have all that connectivity of the data, and then to be able to enact and to collaborate to respond.
So informatics is going to be important, and I'll come to Per about that in a minute.
Absolutely, and I'm sure that all the large companies, small companies, NHS governments is investing in digital tools. We certainly have a large program of digitizing the supply chain, but it's the interconnectivity of the data as well that is important.
Okay, Ravi, same question to you.
So broadly we can classify the risk in about 4 buckets. So one is the external risk, which is basically supply related risks. And talking specifically about the generic industry here, as I said earlier in my opening remarks, there's a lot of dependence in the generic industry on Asia. So 37% of all APIs that go into the generic industry, they come from India. Something like 30% or more come from China. And generics are important in the sense that 90% of volumes are generics. When you come to value, the new drugs appear to be huge in value, but when you come to actual volumes, it's the generics which are dominant. And that's where the external supply related risk or supplier related risk is very critical. So you have dependence on diverse geographies. Sometimes you have examples where there are not more than 1 or 2 API suppliers, so that makes things very critical. Then moving on to the next bucket would be the internal risks, and this is where, as I said earlier, this is also very significant. And again, I'll speak specifically about the generic industry. It's very important to balance inventory and working capital, because the generic industry operates on very slim margins. So it is very, very important to forecast, to predict, and to maintain inventory accordingly. And at the same time, balance it with the working capital and the cash flow. And that's quite a challenge. And that's why probably a lot of supply chain related challenges come in because of these internal problems. And then to add to it, you can also have things like quality management systems, GMP, etc., which can be both internal and external. Yeah. Then the third bucket I would say is logistics related challenges, where things like bureaucracy across borders, in our case Brexit at the moment, is causing certain logistic challenges. And then fourth is how accurately you can forecast demand. And as Per said, IQVIA is one database where we rely on for predicting potential demand, but that can go wrong. And I would say it can go wrong quite a few times. And that's why balancing inventory and cash flow and suppliers' risks become very important.
Thank you very much. So maybe we'll go straight to Per and informatics, Per, and AI. Can we predict the Davina effect, for example, with HRT? Or can we predict the antibiotic supply shortages which occurred?
I will just add that the UK have one more unique challenge here. And that is that in this world that's now fragmenting, you are becoming extremely small after Brexit. So I would never, before Brexit, have believed that there would be sort of export barriers between EU and UK. But that happened during the COVID vaccine, that you refused to export. And that reprogrammed EU. So the present COVID vaccines from Pfizer and Moderna, the only one we are using, are 100, they don't have a single UK component in them any longer. I think UK have a unique challenge to say, how should we, maybe for pharmaceuticals, build up partnerships with other countries and who those should be. But I think it's an interesting aspect from a UK perspective to think on.
The NHS to pick that up and so on in a minute and so on, but tell us about informatics and so on.
So, as I said, this is going to change very quickly. And as you said, this with the forecast, the way we've done forecast going forward, we're largely looking on what has the trends been, is going to, in the next 12 months, have to change to pick up those other signals on what is happening. It should have been done naturally already at the end of the pandemic, looking on how influenza would come back into the game. But there is a lot more than influenza in this. The ability to predict what's going to happen. And if you are a generic manufacturer, the new thing after COVID is that most of the shortage notification we see is not the primary. It was one manufacturer that got a production problem. Then the demand went up for many of the other manufacturers to fill that gap. So there was a lot of what I would call innocent people or they got a business opportunity here, but they got a shortage because of someone else. So we need to build up warning systems. Manufacturer A cannot tell his competitors anything because that's collusion. But we can, as a third party, build up warning system that on one hand, in your closer surrounding, it's happening, but on the other hand, in Europe, we see this is coming just now. Be aware, put people on alert for it. So we are rolling through a process where we have now on national competent authorities, and we have 10 of them just now, not UK, where they have access to the whole European database and the predictions that we're doing. Our next step is to do a much more directed set to each market authorization holder, and then we're going to do it for the buying groups during the year. That's what our goal is. Artificial intelligence machine learning will have big impact because it's a much broader set than just looking on the history of consumption data.
Okay. Bruce, maybe I can, before I open it up to the audience, Bruce, just in terms of, you talked about mitigation strategies at NHS, you've heard some of the issues which are facing the UK, but also the rest of the world. So what are the mitigation strategies that the NHS puts into place?
So that very much depends on what the shortage is and what the reason for that shortage is. And there are a couple of sort of key things that we need to consider. Firstly, the volume. So is this a product that is going to affect a huge number of people? Secondly, the criticality of that medicine, if you like. If we can't get hold of a particular medicine, is that clinically going to cause major problems, or are there alternatives that are equivalent, that kind of thing? And sort of both of those combined, then we then have to consider, how is this going to affect practice? Now, sometimes that means us having to refer patients back into specialists for a review because it's a critical medicine that we just have no alternatives for and they can't get hold of. That in itself brings huge challenges for the NHS and for the practitioners themselves if we're having to refer large numbers or even sometimes smaller numbers of patients back into specialist centres or even back to their GP. You know, we all know in this country the pressure that general practice is under. They don't thank us for making recommendations that patients should go back to their GPs for a review because they can't get hold of their medicines. So the mitigations that we put in place are very much dependent on what the shortage is. But we work very closely with the industry. We work very closely with the MHRA, and I have to say the MHRA do some incredible work when we're in this situation. You know, just things like expediting certain applications, expediting import licenses, expediting batch-specific variations for certain medicines where we really need them to, and that works really well. But what tends to cause us problems is where we, despite the mitigations we can put in place, you know, looking at working with the industry for therapeutic alternatives, and you know, just trying to stop that shortage actually becoming apparent at a patient level through whatever means we can. If it ends up in a change of practice, not only does that cause a problem in terms of seeing the patients, but of course there may be training issues, there may be competence issues with switching from one medicine to another that people aren't familiar with, and depending on what that situation is, we have to put in different mitigations to try and minimise the disruption that causes, and as I said earlier, you know, ultimately keeping our patients safe. I mean, if we look back to a couple of years to when we had shortages with the adrenaline auto-injectors, changing device was a big issue in terms of making sure the patients understood how to use those new devices appropriately. So that causes problems for the pharmacists, it causes problems for the prescribers, and it causes problems for the patients. Other issues, you know, we can work with the MHRA, we can find alternatives that are directly equivalent, and as I say, you know, more often than not, nobody even notices, and we manage that. But those mitigations are very varied.
I don't know if anyone wants to come in, but maybe I can open up first of all to the audience. So, Mark.
I'll speak up. It's a really interesting discussion, and there's a sort of generic problem, which is that it's a stocks and flows problem ultimately, which is as systems have become more efficient, they've become less resilient. And so, please. Thank you, that does work. And so the question, of course, is can we make our stocks last longer? Because drugs tend to have rather short half-lives or supply, and can we actually use them more effectively? But I think coming to the AI question, this could make the problem better or it could make it worse. In other words, if the AI makes the just-in-time supply lines even more efficient, then the danger is that when you have a shock, and you're talking about sort of slightly predictable shocks, but there are in complex systems cascading failures as well. And I think we were jolly lucky not to have cascading failures in COVID of all sorts of infrastructures, not only drugs. So I think there is a real sort of sovereign question, actually, which is, should we improve our stocks and reduce our flows? And that's an industry question as well, because it's the sort of boring stuff. It's the glass vials, it's the syringes, it's the needles. It may be the very basic chemicals in the drugs as well. And when you have a global shock, you suddenly find it all goes pear-shaped.
So, Bruce, what are we doing with our stockpiling, first of all, and what have we learned from Brexit about that? And then maybe you want to maybe comment on this as well.
So I think in some respects, Brexit did us a favour in this, because we put an awful lot of work into preparing for exit from the EU. And stockpiles were established. We worked very closely with the industry on establishing buffer stocks, and particularly in making sure those buffer stocks were onshore, because we didn't know what was going to happen in terms of getting medicines across the Dover Straits and into the country. So a lot of work was done in preparation for EU exit. Also looking at the criticality of the medicines, working with experts in different fields to try and establish which were the really critical medicines that we just could not run out of. And so a lot of that work had been done, and then the pandemic arrived, and actually a lot of the processes that we put in place really came into play during the pandemic, including the establishment of a lot of the governance around all this, and the establishment of the medicine shortage response group, and the processes that we developed to try and make that as robust a process as we possibly could. And actually, although that was initially done with a view to exiting the EU, those processes were established and have remained, so that when the pandemic came, we were in a reasonably good place, as good as we could be under those circumstances, to try and manage shortages that started to become apparent. So, but a big part of that certainly is the establishment of buffer stocks, the establishment of various different stockpiles, some of those government funded, some not, and working with the industry to try and make sure that those medicines not only are somewhere, but are available to us in the UK, and that means sometimes holding bigger stocks onshore, as I say, as opposed to in Europe. But as I say, a lot of the lessons we learned from preparation to leave the EU actually proved very useful when the pandemic came. Okay.
Per, do you want to comment?
Yeah, just a few things. I like the word to prevent. I think that Bruce should not have as much work to do. I think we need to set up a system where we prevent it. I'll give 3 examples. Having looked on Nordic markets, 1/3 of all shortages, single source, there's only one manufacturer, it's not an interchangeable product, small volume product. 1/3 of all shortages is those. Even if you don't use AI, even if you just put it up in a spreadsheet and sort it, you can find that there is characteristics that, so in Sweden it's 350 products where we think the probability in a given year is more than 50% that they should go in shortage. Actually do it very simple. It's not you, Bruce. It's a pricing authority in Sweden that should go out and make an agreement with these manufacturers that they will keep, say, 5 months inventory, but we're willing to double the price. It would cost 0.1% of the Swedish drug budget, and it would reduce the amount of cases that your organization has to deal with. The Norwegian agency says we need multi-country packs, Nordic packs, so we can shift the packs between the countries. And a lot of these, that's really about a pandemic here. We should have had packs that had, and the vaccine more or less had this, has an e-pill, e-package leaflet in it. It could be shifted between the countries freely here. And then the third one is naturally stockpile. So if we really have a critical list, look on Finland. The Finns are smart. They actually have the pre-wholesaler to keep the extra inventory. They rotate the inventory on a FIFO basis. It actually cost about or when interest was low, it costed between 1% and 2% of that drug's cost to do it, funded by the government. They could choose what level, and they had a full transparency on it. 3 ways of preventing. It's preventing we need to do.
Okay, and you were talking about labeling before earlier, and so which is really important. I don't know whether you want to comment on that.
Yes, just comment that absolutely. I mean, there's some mechanisms in terms of mitigations on that visibility, but also looking for opportunities. I mean, if you're able to use labels that can be used for multiple countries. I mean, we see that with a lot of the clinical trials are global in nature, and in order to, because in the earlier phases of development you have a very limited amount anyway of medicine or of vaccine, so in a way you need to think about that resilience and that saving and conserving that. So you introduce some of that thinking, and some of it is the labels, and how can use for groups of countries, for example. Then you've got, if you have the regulatory framework to be able to move that, then obviously it's a lot more efficient than having stocks for every single country. So, although that is done in sort of the clinical supply chain, you can imagine some of those things can go forward. And of course, thinking about innovating how in the future we could have electronic labels that could be updated, and you've got one central stock and then update as you need for other countries. So I think that some of the innovation will help. It will not remove the fact that you need the physical infrastructure. And if it is some actually physical stock, or also some of what was identified through COVID, the infrastructure to be able to not only to discover, but to develop and manufacture in country. And as, specifically in the UK, it was highlighted that, that there is a lack of manufacturing infrastructure, and also late stage development, and to turn around some excellent research, both in companies, small companies, and universities that the UK has, but that translation into rapid being able to scale up and then to manufacture, you still need that physical infrastructure as well, in addition to digital.
Okay. So I've got 2 questions, the first one over there and then one at the back. So you were first, yeah, and then at the back.
Yes, so my question was about the
Please
role
introduce yourself.
Oh, sorry, Mel Walker. I'm an advisor to biotech and digital health companies. My question was about the role of supply chain in supporting health equity, particularly in low and middle income markets. So I think the pandemic taught us that there are certain considerations in some markets that need to be thought about. For example, single-dose vials versus multi-dose vials, the challenges of cold storage in hot countries. Can you tell me a little bit about how these things are taken into account, how early they're thought about by companies, and how this is really done in a way that really supports more globalized health equity?
Thank you. So maybe Ravi, you were involved in the AstraZeneca, and obviously equity there was really important, and then maybe from GSK perspective.
Yes. So talking of equity, I think the way the industry is structured at the moment, I think there's already an inbuilt equity in the sense that most of the essential medicines especially in the generic sector, which account for like 90% of the prescriptions, are actually made in low-cost countries, like say India and China. Yeah. And I think to that extent it does drive equity. In terms of what you mentioned about certain spatial requirements in certain countries, like where the temperatures are high, etc. More and more I'm seeing this trend of countries driving localization, both for addressing this challenge as well as addressing the challenge of economics and promoting the local industry. So let me give you an example of Saudi Arabia, for example. Yeah? Just to give the background, Saudi Arabia does not at the moment have a lot of manufacturing infrastructure. but there is money in Saudi Arabia, as all of us know. And they want to really offer benefits to the industry for doing localization. And that helps them both from economics as well as from the perspective of what you mentioned just now. So, for example, if you make a product in Saudi Arabia, the government signs with you what is called as an offtake agreement for, say, a period of 3 years or 5 years, where there is a guaranteed offtake of your product. You are given a preferential treatment in the tender, and you are also given a 10% higher price for making the product in Saudi Arabia as compared to Saudi Arabia importing that product. So it serves two purposes. First is it addresses the problem that you mentioned, and Saudi Arabia is a hot country, as all of us know. So it to an extent simplifies supply chain, and it also helps the country economically and sort of helps the development of the pharmaceutical manufacturing infrastructure in that country.
Great, thank you. Luisa?
I think that, just following, I think that your question was when to start thinking about that medicine access. And it actually starts very early in the development of a medicine, even with a medicine vision, because ultimately you want something that is easy for the patient to take, but it's also easy to manufacture. So, you can start thinking, and sometimes it's quite tricky because you're developing at the same time, the process, the way of optimizing how you manufacture the drug substance, the drug product, what is the presentation. But the thinking starts very early with the medicine vision and looking at what ultimately the patient will need. And sometimes you need to go through several iterations. And a good example that we have is, for example, and something that I've been involved very closely with, HIV treatment. And, several mechanisms of improving the patient experience, but also medicine access. The patient experience, obviously, there was if you compare when we started the treatments to where we are now, with those multiple different types of pills and different types of dosage forms and presentations to what we have today, in terms of either single dose or even long-acting injectables that people only take every 2 months, is just a world of difference. But at the same time, we have a program of optimizing the process development and the cost of goods and so on, as well as being able to go room temperature rather than cold chain. All that thinking. And there's been, I don't know how many generations we have now of those medicines, always with that intent. So initially, sometimes you're not able to deploy all those optimization elements, but the thinking starts actually quite early in the development cycle. And as everybody knows, medicine development can take quite a long time. 8 years, 10 years is not unusual.
Great, thank you. So over there, please.
Sure. Hi, I'm Nathan Sigworth from CCX. A little bit of a related question. I think Ravi mentioned, not every life-saving drug is essentially a $1,000 injection pen, right? I, in a previous life, spent a decade working in emerging market supply chain, building tech infrastructure. And I saw people make really challenging trade-offs, running very lean, high-volume operations on the cost and the risk of supply chain risk management. I guess my question is, brass tacks, economically and financially speaking, how should companies and how do companies and policymakers think about those financial trade-offs, managing risk and cost, in investing in the supply chain, mitigating supply chain risk, particularly in the high volume areas?
Okay, so maybe Ravi again, first of all to you, and then to Luisa.
Yeah. So essentially, it's a very, very good question. Let's take the example of UK. We know that we have gaps in manufacturing in UK, especially in, say, aseptic manufacturing. And an obvious question would be, should there be local manufacturing in UK? Yeah. Now, there's no easy answer to this. I mean, if you really look at economics, it's going to be very tough, especially in the context of what you said, of high volume medicines and medicines which are not essentially, which carry a price tag of 1,000, say, pounds. Those kind of medicines is going to be very tough to manufacture in UK, even if there is a gap and we recognize there is a gap. Yeah. The reason being, even if you compare UK with, say, the cost of manufacture in, say, countries like Poland or countries like Spain or Italy, which are still higher cost as compared to, say, in India or China. Even there, I think the difference in cost of manufacturing is almost 3 times. So economics is going to be making it very difficult to, howsoever we may like, that there should be more manufacturing in UK and the gap should be closed. The economics is going to make it very difficult. So the answer to your question is, to mitigate this, more dependence on low-cost manufacture. There doesn't look to be any other option. So there will be more geographical diversity in terms of supply chain, more dependence on countries like India, China, to a lesser extent countries in Europe like Poland, Spain, Italy, Greece, so on and so forth. So I think that's the only solution, and that solution already exists. But whether that helps some of the countries like UK or not, answer is probably no. But I don't know what's the solution to that.
Okay. Luisa?
And perhaps, being my knowledge and exposure is very much on the clinical, supply chain, and of course not so much my colleagues in the commercial supply chain would be, better placed to answer all the elements. But there's clearly a level of investment in terms not only, yes, it's diversification and looking at multiple, using multiple nodes and countries, but there is also an element of process optimization and investment, both internal nodes and with partner companies to try to, improve processes, simplify, reduce costs. So there is, an effort that is, and all companies, this is not GSK only, will have, big programs and investments to simplify and to make processes more efficient. In terms of the policy question that you asked, perhaps it's better other panel member to pick up.
Sure. Okay. Well, we are running out of time, so I want to give each panel member a chance to say one thing before we finish, and that is, the question really is, what do we need to do to improve medicines supply resilience? So just one thing, if you had your wish, which was going to come true, starting from Per, and you can repeat what Per says or whatever as we move along to this side. So
I actually think the first thing is to increase the transparency, so we actually can, as much as possible, have earlier warnings to people. So if I only can do one, that's my first step.
Okay. Bruce?
Yeah, linked to that, I would say early information. Far too often we are getting notified of discontinuations and things like that at a very, very late stage, which causes huge problems. So that early information, that early intelligence would be vital.
And just to a sub-question, does the NHS have its own informatic system that it looks at in terms of supply?
Well,
problems?
historically, it's relied on retrospective dispensing data. Right. From the NHS, but I think the Strep A issue we saw over the Christmas period saw a move to much more real-time prescribing data. Again, this isn't the sort of data I think that Per was talking about, but that helps because it's in real time as opposed to a retrospective. But if we could become much more proactive and get that advanced warning, that would make a huge difference.
Okay, so Ravi and then Luisa.
So I would say collaboration, and I would draw the parallel with the pandemic. What made us successful in the pandemic was collaboration across the industry, across all stakeholders. I think there is a case for collaboration even in managing supply chains in a better way. And just extending on what I said earlier about this, how do you make supply chain resilient in, say, UK, or how do you bring in manufacturing in UK, or at least some kind of activity in UK? I think probably the answer is out-of-box collaboration, where if companies can come together, say joint purchasing or joint warehousing or joint manufacturing, and see if you can bring the cost down and make your supply chain more resilient.
Great, thank you, Luisa.
Very good. May I have two? I would
Yes,
say
please, go ahead.
Anticipation and collaboration. And that anticipation for me is that ability to predict and to use, make much better use of the data that is already there and to be able to connect. And then, the collaboration, I think it's really important. You can't do anything by yourself.
Okay, well, thank you very much, all of you. I think, as I said when I started, this is complicated. There's no single simple solution to this. But thank you very much for your insights to the panel. So please do show your sign of appreciation. Thank you.